It was Labor Day weekend, September 1st, 1986, when two bright young women, Dawn McCreery, 20, and Wendy Offredo, 21, left the University of Akron campus for a drive that should have lasted minutes. But they never made it home. On a lonely highway overpass just outside the city, 19-year-old Richard Wade Cooey II and his friend Clifton Dickens stood above the road throwing rocks at passing cars, a cruel game meant to cause chaos. One of those rocks struck Dawn and Wendy's car, shattering their windshield and forcing them to stop. When the girls pulled over for help, Cooey and Dickens offered a hand and instead led them into hell. They kidnapped the women at knife point, driving them to a wooded area outside Akron. For hours, the girls were tortured, raped, and brutally murdered. Their bodies were found the next day, beaten, strangled, and left in the dirt. When questioned, Cooey bragged about what he'd done. He showed no remorse, no regret, just pride. It was a crime that would haunt Ohio for decades, not only for its brutality, but for what came next, a 22-year legal battle that tested the limits of justice, mercy, and human patience. This is the story of Richard Wade Cooey, the soldier-turned-killer who claimed he was too fat to be executed, and the two women whose lives he stole for sport. Classification: murderer characteristics, rape. Robbery, number of victims. 2. Date of murder, September 1st, 1986. Date of birth, June 9, 1907. Victims profile: Dawn McCreery, 20, and Wendy Offredo, 21, university students. Method of murder: strangulation with shoelace. Location: Summit County, Ohio, USA. Status: executed by lethal injection in Ohio on October 14, 2008. Dawn McCreery, 20, and Wendy Offredo, 21, were University of Akron sorority sisters who were leaving their jobs as waitresses when 17-year-old Clint Dickens threw a chunk of concrete off an I-77 overpass, striking the windshield of the car that Ms. Offredo was driving. Cooey, who was 19 and on leave from the U.S. Army, was hanging out with a longtime friend, Kenny Horonetz, and Dickens. The three got into a car and offered the two women help. The five drove to a shopping mall and Miss Offredo used a payphone to call her mother. "I'm game if you're game," Cooey said as Dickens suggested they rob the two women. Cooey pulled a knife on the women when they realized they were not being driven back to their car. Horonetz demanded to be let out of the car after Cooey told him to tie Ms. McCreery's hands. Driving to a wooded area in nearby Norton, Dickens and Cooey both raped the two girls. Dickens then suggested the women should be killed because they knew his name records show. Dickens grabbed Ms. Offredo in a chokehold, and Cooey used a shoelace to strangle her as Dickens strangled Ms. McCreery with his other shoelace. Cooey beat both women with a club. Dickens was sentenced to life in prison for the crimes in which both girls suffered through more than 3 hours of torture. Cooey executed by lethal injection. OCT 14-2000. Richard Wade Cooey was executed at 10:28 this morning for the murders of two University of Akron students 22 years ago. His final statement was, "You expletive have not paid attention to anything I've had to say for the past 22 years. Why would you pay attention to anything I have to say now?" Cooey paced for much of the night, sleeping for less than 90 minutes and turning down breakfast as his execution drew near. Cooey's attorneys arrived at the prison this morning, but a spokeswoman for the Ohio Public Defender's Office last night said that he appeared out of appeal options. Cooey, 41, formerly of Akron, was sentenced to die in 1986 for the murders of Wendy Offredo and Dawn McCreery, two UA juniors. He was within 12 hours of being executed in 2003 before a judge granted him a stay. Prison spokeswoman Andrea Carson told reporters this morning that Cooey was quiet overnight inside the death house at the Southern Ohio Correctional Facility near Lucasville. He finished his last meal around midnight, appeared sleepless, and paced his cell. Around 4:06 a.m., he fell asleep only to awaken at 5:20 a.m. He showered and is visiting now with his attorneys. About 9:50 a.m., Warden Philip Kearns approached Cooey and read the state's death warrant. Cooey was then fitted with shunts in each arm that were used to transfer the lethal drugs into his system. After long battle, killer executed. First lethal injection in 1.5 years seems to go smoothly. October 15, 2008. Lucasville, Ohio. The anger and uncertainty were over for Richard Wade Cooey III at 10:28 a.m. yesterday as he lay motionless on the lethal injection table at the Southern Ohio Correctional Facility. Cooey's long fight to avoid execution for murdering Wendy Offredo, 21, and Dawn McCreery, 20, was punctuated by last words of defiance. But as he lay dying, the 3 execution drugs flowing into his veins, the 41-year-old Summit County man was calm and quiet, showing no outward signs of pain. Cooey's death, the first in Ohio in 18 months and the 27th since capital punishment resumed in 1999, will ease but not erase the pain for the families of Offredo and McCreery. Offredo's family chose not to attend the execution, but Mary Ann Hackenberg and Robert McCreery Sr. The victim's parents were witnesses along with her brother and 3 cousins. Likewise, the execution did not banish the suffering of Catherine Miracle Melissa Wilkinson and Tammy Brown, Three of the victims' Alpha Delta Pi sorority sisters in the mid-1980s at the University of Akron. Miracle Wilkinson and Brown pulled up their sport utility vehicle to the Lucasville prison early yesterday, parking a few hundred yards from a circle of capital punishment protesters. They opened the tailgate and set up an impromptu display that included a composite sorority photo with McCreery's picture. Offredo graduated the previous year. For Miracle, the past 2 decades have been scarred by thoughts of the abduction, rape, and murder of her friends in a deserted area of Norton in northeastern Ohio on September 1, 1986. Miracle was supposed to ride along with Offredo and McCreery to the Harbor Inn and Akron area bar. But Miracle and McCreery argued, and Miracle drove separately from her little sister in the sorority. Offredo and McCreery never made it to the bar. Cooey and 2 accomplices dropped a 35-pound chunk of concrete onto their car from an I-77 overpass. "I was supposed to guide and protect her," Miracle said. "There were a lot of times over the years that I didn't feel I did that. I would wake up and think, why am I here and she's not?" At the other end of the prison parking lot, Sister Alice Gerdeman, president of Ohioans to Stop Executions, prayed with about 30 people. "The crime that was committed was horrendous," she said in an interview. "I pray for the victims' families and for Richard Cooey and his family. There is no happiness here, just deep, deep pain." Inside the prison, Cooey was being prepped in his cell by medical technicians who inserted intravenous needles into both arms. In a flurry of lawsuits during the past few months, Cooey's attorneys alleged that finding a suitable vein could be a problem because of his obesity. He weighed 275 pounds and was 5 feet 7 inches tall. The prison technician, as observed by witnesses on a monitor, had trouble inserting the first needle, prompting Cooey to call out loudly, "I want to talk to Greg Myers." Myers, one of Cooey's public defender attorneys, was a witness but was not allowed to respond to his client. Myers told the dispatch later that Cooey cried out because the first needle missed the vein and had to be reinserted. He was afraid he was going to have a botched execution like the others, Myers said, referring to 2 problematic lethal injections in Ohio since 2006. However, IV lines in both arms eventually were established. Cooey spat out his last words, "You expletive haven't paid any attention to anything I've said in the last 22 years. Why would you pay any attention to anything I say now?" On his last night, Cooey had a big meal, a T-bone steak with A1 sauce, French fries, and onion rings, 4 eggs over easy hash browns, buttered toast, bear claw pastries, a pint of Rocky Road ice cream, and Mountain Dew. The prison waived its non-smoking policy, allowing him to smoke in his death house cell. Richard Wade Cooey II executed for McCreery Offredo murders. October 15, 2000. Richard Wade Cooey II died peacefully Tuesday with a lethal combination of drugs administered through 2 needles inserted gently into veins in each arm. He was executed by the state of Ohio for the rape and murders, by bludgeoning and strangulation, of 2 college students who were not afforded such comfort in their deaths. "It's done," said Marianne Hackenberg, mother of one of the victims, Dawn McCreery, who said she could sense her daughter's presence in the death chamber. "I know she was there," she said. "I felt her there." Cooey was sentenced to death in 1986 for the rape and murder that year of the 20-year-old McCreery and her sorority sister, Wendy Offredo, 21. He was hours away from execution when he won a reprieve in 2003. Tuesday, his appeals ran out when the U.S. Supreme Court denied his last-ditch effort. He remained defiant even in his final statement, uttering an obscenity when Warden Philip Collins held a microphone above his lips before a combination of 3 drugs flowed through the tubes over the course of nearly 10 minutes, ending his life. "You haven't paid any attention to what I've had to say over the past 22.5 years. Why are you going to pay attention to what I have to say now?" he said, not looking at any of the 6 witnesses from the McCreery family or his 3 lawyers and a spiritual advisor who were witnesses. At 10:06 a.m., a monitor in the witness viewing room flickered to life, showing Cooey lying on a gurney in a prep room adjacent to the death chamber, his feet crossed. Technicians inserted ports into veins in each arm without difficulty, despite his legal claims that his veins would be too difficult to access, partly because of his obesity. Marianne Hackenberg of Rocky River Dawn, McCreery's mother and one of 6 witnesses from the McCreery family, said, "They got it. When the needle was inserted." Cooey shouted for his lawyer, Greg Myers, twice. Myers, who was in the witness room along with 2 other lawyers and Cooey's spiritual advisor, did not move. At 10:15 a.m., with ports inserted and his arms strapped to boards, Cooey kicked his legs, got off the gurney, and walked to the death chamber, where he climbed onto another gurney. 6 guards in white strapped him down with 4 black straps. Tubing, which extended from the wall in the adjacent room, was connected to the ports. At 10:19, Cooey made his final statement and drummed his fingers, pinky to index finger, on the board supporting his left arm. At 10:21, he exhaled with a faint noise. Warden Philip Kearns of the Southern Ohio Correctional Facility shook Cooey's shoulder. He did not respond. By 10:28, he was dead. Sodium pentothal-induced deep sleep, pancuronium bromide stopped his breathing, and potassium chloride stopped his heart. Hackenberg threw back her head and exhaled as a curtain was drawn across the viewing window. She hugged her son Rob McCreery and held the hand of her ex-husband Robert McCreery Sr. A black hearse waited outside the death house to take Cooey's body. Dana Cole, who identified himself as Cooey's lawyer and friend, and to whom Cooey's cremated remains will be given, said Cooey was an immature 19-year-old influenced by drugs and alcohol when he committed his crime. What we witness here today was a killing that was planned and funded for more than 2 years, he said. The man killed was not the same man who committed the crimes. Rob McCreery, Dawn's brother, said Cooey is exactly the same proven by his final words. Just being spiteful to the very end, said Rob McCreery. It just shows how much this was warranted and justified. After the execution, the family talked of their relief that Cooey had finally been brought to justice, and the peacefulness of his passing despite his claims that lethal injection was cruel and unusual. The thing that's going to now give us the greatest comfort is knowing that he now has to be accountable to a power greater than himself, and now he's got to reckon with that, said Dawn McCreery's cousin, Kathy Miska, one of the witnesses of the execution. Hackenberg was at once relieved and still angry. It was too easy. It's as much justice as we're going to get, as much closure as we'll get, but it was just too easy, she said. He didn't get a free pass, said her husband, John Hackenberg. Rob McCreery said he had hoped for the execution for so long. He was 17 when his big sister was killed, that he's not sure where to turn his attention now. But I can tell you, it was a nicer day coming out of there than it was going in, he said. Cooey is the first Ohio inmate to be executed since May 2007, the 27th since 1999. Cooey was 19 and home on leave from the Army when in 1986 the Akron native and an accomplice 17-year-old Clint Dickens raped and murdered Offredo and McCreery. Dickens threw a chunk of concrete from an overpass onto Offredo's car, disabling it. They then drove down to the highway and picked up the women, offering to get them help. Instead, they drove them to a secluded field in Norton where they raped them, beat them with a wooden club, and strangled them with shoelaces. Dickens was sentenced to life in prison for the crimes in which both girls suffered through more than 3 hours of what Summit County prosecutor Sherry Bevan Walsh called fear and torture and agony. Because he was a juvenile when he committed the crime, he wasn't eligible for the death penalty. The night before his execution, as Cooey sat on his bed or paced and slept for slightly more than an hour, Dawn McCreery's family gathered in her brother Rob's hotel room, sharing stories, watching the Browns' unexpected victory, and drinking cold beers. Summit County prosecutor Sherry Bevan Walsh joined them. Rob McCreery opened a gift bag from a former Alpha Delta Pi sorority sister of Dawn and Wendy. It was a shirt with the sorority's Greek lettering, one that Dawn had actually worn. The card said it was for Rob McCreery's 5-year-old daughter. The morning sky, still dark, was full of stars as a nearly full moon loomed over the hills of Lucasville. At breakfast in the Holiday Inn Express, someone noted that it was a harvest moon, perfect for execution day. "You reap what you sow," said Nicole McCreery, Rob's wife. Ohio executes man who argued he was too fat to die. Lucasville, Ohio. Ohio executed a 5'7", 267-pound double murderer Tuesday who argued his obesity made death by lethal injection inhumane. Richard Cooey, 41, had argued in numerous legal challenges that his weight problem would make it difficult for prison staff to find suitable veins to deliver the deadly chemicals, a problem that delayed previous executions in the state. There were no such difficulties, said Larry Green, a spokesman for the Southern Ohio Correctional Facility. During preparations, though, Cooey shouted for one of his attorneys as prison staff tried to insert a shunt in his left arm. He was worried the staff would botch the execution, said Greg Myers, an attorney with the Ohio Public Defender's Office. Cooey, who killed 2 University of Akron students in 1986, walked into the death chamber wearing gray pants and a black short-sleeve shirt and was strapped onto the gurney. "For what? You expletive haven't paid any attention to anything I've said in the last 22 and a half years. Why would anyone pay any attention to anything I've had to say now?" Cooey said, looking at the ceiling. He made no other comment. Cooey tapped the fingers of his left hand several times before he died, and his face took on a purple shade. 6 family members of one of his victims quietly watched the execution. Marianne Hackenberg, the mother of Dawn McCreery, who was 20 when she was killed, looked to the ceiling and let out a sigh when Cooey's death was announced at 10:28 a.m. Summit County prosecutor Sherry Bevan Walsh said the family was disappointed that Cooey was vulgar and hateful to the end. He still would not apologize and still would not accept responsibility for what he did, she said. 3 of Cooey's lawyers served as his witnesses. The government has no conscience-only policy. Today the policy was state-sanctioned murder of Richard Cooey, said one of the lawyers, Eric Allen. Cooey was the first inmate executed in Ohio in more than a year, and the state's first since the end of the unofficial moratorium on executions that began last year while the U.S. Supreme Court reviewed Kentucky's lethal injection procedure. Cooey lost a final appeal earlier Tuesday when the U.S. Supreme Court turned down without comment his complaint that the state's protocol for lethal injection could cause an agonizing and painful death. Cooey wanted the state to use a single drug rather than a 3-drug combination and asked for a stay of execution pending a hearing on that motion. The court on Monday denied a separate appeal based on Cooey's claim that his obesity was a bar to humane lethal injection. Cooey was 75 pounds heavier than when he went to death row, the result of prison food and 23-hour-a-day confinement, his lawyer said. The last Ohio inmate to be executed was Christopher Newton, who was similar in size to Cooey in May 2000. The execution team had trouble putting IVs in his arm, delaying his execution nearly 2 hours. There were similar problems in the execution of another inmate in 2000. Cooey made an earlier trip to the death house, but a U.S. District Court judge intervened hours before his scheduled execution in July 2003 when the Ohio Public Defender's Office said it needed more time to assess the case after an appeals court dismissed his previous attorneys for inadequate representation. Cooey and a co-defendant were convicted in the sexual assaults and slayings of McCreery and Wendy Offredo 21 in September 1986. His co-defendant was 17 and was sentenced to life in prison because of his age. The state has now executed 27 inmates since 1999 when Ohio renewed executions after more than 3 decades. Condemned inmate Richard Cooey said he won't make a final statement if his execution moves forward as scheduled on Thursday. Cooey said he may write a statement that would be handed out after his death by injection at the maximum security prison near Lucasville. "What could I possibly say?" Cooey said yesterday in what may be his last interview from death row. "Other than what I have said with regards to just give me a shot in the courts, and I feel I have been wronged in the courts. And with regards to the victims' families, I am truly sorry for what happened. But like I said, there are no words they could possibly accept in my opinion or even believe," he added. Cooey, 36, is on death row at the maximum security prison in Mansfield for kidnapping, raping, assaulting, and murdering 20-year-old Dawn McCreery and Wendy Offredo 21 on September 1, 1986. They were University of Akron sorority sisters who were leaving their jobs as waitresses when 17-year-old Clint Dickens threw a chunk of concrete off an I-77 overpass, striking the windshield of the car that Ms. Offredo was driving. Cooey, who was on leave from the Army, was hanging out with a longtime friend, Kenny Horonetz, and Dickens. The 3 got into the car Cooey had borrowed from his grandmother and offered the 2 women help. The 5 drove to a shopping mall and Ms. Offredo used a payphone to call her mother. "I'm game if you're game," Cooey said, as Dickens suggested they rob the 2 women according to court records. They had $37. Cooey pulled a knife on the women when they realized they were not being driven back to their car. Horonetz demanded to be let out of the car after Cooey told him to tie Ms. McCreery's hands. Driving to a wooded area in nearby Norton, Dickens raped Ms. Offredo. "Hey Clint, put on the Bad Company tape," Cooey said, court records say. That led Dickens to say the women should be killed because they knew his name records show. Dickens grabbed Ms. Offredo in a chokehold and Cooey used a shoelace to strangle her as Dickens strangled Ms. McCreery with his other shoelace. Cooey beat both women with a club, court records say. A coroner's report said they died from the blows. In yesterday's interview, Cooey maintained that Dickens, who could not receive the death sentence because he was 17 at the time of the murders, killed the 2 women. Dickens is serving 2 life sentences at the Ross Correctional Institution. Cooey claimed that his attorney let a plea agreement fall through in which he would have pleaded guilty to lesser charges. Cooey said he raped Ms. Offredo, but he said it was rape under duress. "I was looking at it. You know when you're a kid and you're high and bombed? I was looking at it at the time as getting laid. In hindsight now, I've matured and I've got a clear head, and I've seen that it wasn't," he said. Cooey said he had drunk a dozen beers, snorted cocaine, and smoked opium and marijuana that night. Yesterday, he said, Horonetz, who served 8 months in prison on a felonious assault and obstructing justice conviction, probably could have prevented the killings if he had talked some sense into me. Mark Gribben, a spokesman for the state attorney general's office, said, "There is no doubt about Cooey's involvement in the robbery, the assaults, the rapes, and the murders." The judicial process in this matter has been exhausted and complete. His case has been considered by state and federal appellate courts as well as the state parole board by Mr. Gribben said. Cooey said he is spending most of his time in his death row cell drafting appeals on an electric typewriter that his public defenders gave him. Asked if he has any hope he won't be executed on Thursday, Cooey replied, "Not much, but there's always hope." And then he laughed. He said he has not received many visits on death row over 16 years, with the exception of his father, Richard Cooey Sr., and grandmother Audrey. Cooey said he keeps to himself on death row and does not get in the mix of the rat race. Asked to elaborate, he said, "To be point-blank messing with the homosexuals, gambling, and stuff like that? I don't partake in any of it." Cooey said he won't need a sedative as the state prepares to execute him. "You've got to face it. It comes with being an adult. It comes with owning up to what society wants," he said. Update. A federal judge last night postponed the execution of Richard Cooey, a convicted murderer, who was scheduled to be put to death this morning. Judge Dan Aaron Polster of U.S. District Court in Cleveland granted the request of Cooey's lawyer for more time to study the case. Polster appointed Gregory Myers of the Ohio Public Defender's Office to take over the case after an appeals court dismissed Cooey's previous attorneys. "Ultimately, I have concluded that the integrity of the federal court would be impugned if the state of Ohio executes Richard Cooey tomorrow," Polster said. Cooey, 36, was scheduled to die by injection today at the Southern Ohio Correctional Facility in Lucasville. He arrived from death row in Mansfield yesterday morning, said Andrea Dean, a prison system spokeswoman. Attorney General Jim Petro's office said it would appeal Polster's ruling. "We respectfully disagree with the judge's ruling, and we are currently working on an appeal with the Sixth Circuit," Mark Gribben, a spokesman for Petro, said late yesterday. "That appeal will be filed tonight. The judges will make their decision when they decide." Governor Bob Taft on Tuesday denied Cooey's request for clemency. Cooey admits he kidnapped, robbed, and raped University of Akron sorority sisters Wendy Offredo, 21, and Dawn McCreery, 20, of North Ridgeville in September 1986. He denied he killed them, but says he's morally responsible for the murders. According to court documents, Cooey was on leave from the Army when he and a friend, Clint Dickens, attacked the women. Dickens was 17 then and could not be sentenced to death. He is serving a life sentence. Richard Wade Cooey, June 13, 2005. Richard Wade Cooey sits on death row in Ohio on borrowed time, but he's got plenty of it. 2 years ago next month, Cooey was 13 hours from a date with the executioner when his attorneys completed the legal equivalent of football's Hail Mary play and bought the rapist murderer something he denied his 2 young victims more time to live. Recently, Cooey marked the end of his 19th year on death row. He has spent almost as much time there as his victims, Dawn McCreery and Wendy Offredo, spent on Earth. In 1986, Cooey was home on leave from the U.S. Army. He spent the day of August 31st drinking with a pair of friends from high school, Clint Dickens, and another man who was not charged in relation to the crimes that sent Cooey to death row. Late in the evening, on the 31st, Cooey and his brain trust were amusing themselves by throwing pieces of concrete from an overpass at the cars on the highway below. One of the concrete blocks about the size of a basketball struck the windshield of a car driven by college student Wendy Offredo, who, along with her friend Dawn McCreery, had just finished a shift at a local coffee shop, the Brown Derby. The women were unhurt by the attack, but that was when their luck ran out. Cooey, Dickens, and the other man approached the women who had pulled the undrivable car over to the side of the highway and offered to take them back to a nearby shopping center to call for assistance. The women accepted the ride. While Wendy was talking to her mother, Dickens saw money in her purse. He suggested to Cooey and the other man that the three of them rob Wendy and Dawn. Cooey replied, "I'm game if you're game." This agreement came after Cooey himself spoke with Mrs. Offredo and promised her that nothing bad would happen to the girls. The group then left the deserted mall. When they realized Cooey was not returning to the site of the accident, the women asked Cooey where he was going. He pulled out a knife and ordered them to shut up. He then gave the knife to Dickens, who opened it and held it on the women. Dawn gave up her purse while she and Wendy asked their assailants not to hurt them. Cooey told one of his friends to tie Dawn's hands, whereupon the man demanded to be let out of the car, and Cooey let him out. He did not call police to report the abduction, however. Cooey drove the car to an isolated wooded area, and the victims were forced to exit the car. Cooey raped McCreery while Dickens raped Offredo. Then Cooey raped Offredo while Dickens raped McCreery. During this time, Cooey called out Dickens' name. "Hey, Clint, put on the Bad Company tape," he said, which infuriated him. Dickens grabbed a billy club which had been placed on the hood of the car and began hitting a tree. It was at that point that the men decided the girls had to die. Cooey grabbed Offredo in a chokehold, strangling her until she was unconscious. Once she was on the ground, he tied her feet together with a red bandana. Dickens clubbed McCreery with the billy club when she attempted to escape. She eventually slumped to the ground. Cooey tied a shoestring around Offredo's neck, and Dickens tied another around McCreery's. During this episode, both victims were beaten in the head with the billy club, and McCreery was stabbed in the neck. A few days following the murders, an informant called Akron detectives telling the police that Cooey was trying to sell jewelry belonging to the victims. The informant named the street Cooey lived on. The police immediately set up surveillance around Cooey's house while 2 warrants were being obtained, one to search and one to arrest Cooey. Cooey attempted to leave the house and he was arrested. Items were removed from his person and from his grandmother's automobile. Thereafter, the house was searched and various items were removed. Dickens the juvenile was tried as an adult. He was found guilty and sentenced to life imprisonment. Cooey waived his right to a trial by jury and a panel of judges was assigned to try him. Cooey was found guilty of 2 counts of aggravated murder, 2 counts of aggravated robbery, 2 counts of kidnapping, 1 count of felonious assault, and 4 counts of rape by the panel of judges and sentenced to death. The dance of the appellate lawyers began in 1987 and the convictions were upheld on direct and post-conviction appeals. In 2000, a Sixth Circuit panel denied Cooey's habeas corpus petition, after expressing its tentative conclusion that Cooey had failed to make a substantial showing of the denial of a constitutional right. The judges directed him to show cause why it should not deny his application for permission to appeal that decision. Attached to the show cause order was an appendix summarizing the panel's tentative findings with respect to each issue raised in the appeal. The appendix also detailed numerous instances of Cooey's careless or worse brief writing. The appellate panel found that some of Cooey's claims were irrelevant, his case law inapposite, and his factual assertions erroneous, a district court judge would write later. In June 2003, after an execution date was set by the Ohio Supreme Court, the Ohio Parole Board conducted a clemency hearing and recommended Governor Bob Taft deny clemency, which he did. On June 10, 2003, a little over 1 month before Cooey's execution date, the Chief Deputy Clerk of the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals mailed letters to the 2 attorneys who had represented Cooey in his habeas appeal, advising them that the Court of Appeals had removed them as his appellate counsel. The court has authorized me to tell you that you will not receive any new appointments on appeal or extensions of appointments under the Criminal Justice Act in capital cases, the letters read. This reflects the court's dissatisfaction with both the quality of the appellate briefs and the oral argument in Cooey v. Coyle and the amount of the attorney's fees which were paid to you in co-counsel for Mr. Cooey's representation. The clerk then asked the Ohio Public Defender to find counsel to represent Cooey in the event that he intended to initiate any further federal litigation. The public defender worked diligently to find someone but reported back to the court on July 12, 2003, 12 days before Cooey's scheduled execution, that no one would take the case. On Wednesday, July 16, 2003, Cooey filed in district court a pro se motion to appoint counsel in this death penalty case, in which execution is set for July 24, 2003. The federal judge appointed the Ohio Public Defender's Office to represent Cooey. On July 22, 2003, Cooey filed a Rule 60B motion and a motion for stay of execution. Federal Rule of Civil Procedure 60B provides a party with relief from judgment, under certain circumstances, on motion and upon such terms as are just. The court may relieve a party or a party's legal representative from a final judgment order or proceeding for the following reasons: 1. Mistake, inadvertence, surprise, or excusable neglect, or any other reason justifying relief from the operation of the judgment. On July 23rd, the families of Wendy Offredo and Dawn McCreery gathered in Lucasville, Ohio, site of the execution chamber, where the next day Richard Cooey would pay the ultimate price for his crimes. Fate had another cruel twist in store for them. The Rule 60B motion was made to Judge Dan Aaron Polster, who wrote just 13 hours before Cooey was to die. The underlying premise of the stay of execution is that the Court of Appeals letters to Cooey's prior appellate habeas counsel have cast a cloud over the integrity of the habeas process and that it would be unseemly for Cooey to be executed while that cloud exists. Rule 60. B. Relief is reserved for those cases of injustices which in certain instances are deemed sufficiently gross and to prevent grave miscarriages of justice. The court finds that the extraordinary circumstances in this case could warrant Rule 60B relief. It is for the Sixth Circuit to make the ultimate determination as to the meaning and import of its June 10, 2003 letters. I have had 48 hours to grapple with this unprecedented situation. Ultimately, I have concluded that the integrity of the federal courts would be impugned if the state of Ohio executes Richard Cooey tomorrow. Polster knew the character of the man he was sparing. Here, Richard Cooey brutally raped and murdered 2 women. He and his associates set up this heinous crime by standing on a bridge and dropping a concrete chunk through the windshield of a randomly selected car as it passed underneath, he wrote. Cooey and his associates then tortured and murdered the 2 victims under the guise of offering assistance. A state that elects to establish a system of capital punishment presumably has in mind such defendants. Reasoned and thoughtful people may debate the significance of the life of Richard Cooey. The function of federal habeas corpus, however, is to ensure the integrity of a state's judicial process, particularly when that may culminate in a defendant's execution. It is our responsibility as federal judges to ensure the integrity of our own process, and that is why I've stayed Cooey's execution. Eventually, the Sixth Circuit ruled that Cooey deserved another chance to demonstrate that his appellate lawyers were ineffective. His second round of post-conviction appeals is working its way through the state system. On October 14, 2008, after more than 2 decades of appeals, Richard Wade Cooey finally faced justice. In his final moments, he offered no apology, only bitterness. "You've been killing me for 22 years. I've had enough. I'm done." As the lethal injection began, witnesses said he calmly tapped his fingers on the table, the same hands that once held his victims down. He was pronounced dead at 10:28 a.m. For the families of Dawn McCreery and Wendy Offredo, it wasn't closure, but it was something. Because justice delayed is still justice served. And while Cooey's name fades into history, their names Dawn and Wendy will forever stand as reminders of the innocent stolen and the evil that walked among them. In the end, monsters die, but memories never do.